Hearing parents may be willing to learn ASL, recognizing that will be a lot of work. They may feel paranoid, wondering whether they'll ever be able to sign well enough to benefit their deaf children. Again, the research that we have so far on this is limited. But we do know that parents don't have to have a huge vocabulary and perfect grammar from the beginning. In the beginning, it's all right to sign in short sentences. The key aspect is how one signs, how one uses eye gaze, body movement. All of these things together accommodate a deaf child's needs. It doesn't matter if the vocabulary is limited or the grammar isn't actually perfect. One point that has come up recently several times is the topic of child-directed signing or child-directed speech. Both of these are abbreviated CDS. Child-directed signing or speech means that when an adult is talking to a baby or to young children, they sometimes modify their language to accommodate that child. Sometimes this might involve pitch changes, non-manuals, things that are different from the way that we would normally talk to another adult. We probably wouldn't have that same type of signing or that rhythm with an adult. Of course, this is variable. Some people use more of these changes and some use less. But there is something that modifies the language to make it for the baby. And babies are attracted to that kind of language. They look longer, and this facilitates interaction between the parent and the child. Most of that research is from spoken language, but recently, sign language researchers have found parallels for sign language as well. Child-directed signing. These are modifications to the way that people sign to young children and babies, and they're fundamentally very similar to child-directed speech. Some researchers have looked specifically at the features of child-directed signing and what those involve. Some examples might be the use of prosody, which we mentioned earlier, the way the body moves, the rhythm of the language. So all those things accommodate young children. Signs are also made bigger in the signing space. There's more repetition, and very often there are exaggerated non-manuals. When adults sign with young children, young deaf children, they may also move their bodies depending on where the child is looking. The child looks away, the parent moves the body to stay in the sight lines of that child. Again, this is different than what we typically do with other adults. We stay in one place and we sign in that space. However, child-directed signing is modified for the child. There's also natural variation in languages, different options for signing the same basic content. But child-directed signing tends to favor the patterns that are more representative of the language. For instance, a typical sign has movement, but some signs, the hand itself doesn't actually move. For example, we have the sign sometimes glossed as mommy and the sign glossed as mother. The meaning is approximately the same. However, mother has a hand movement, which is more typical of signs in general. The hand itself moves in space. Mommy is a little bit more exceptional, because even though there's movement, the entire hand stays in place. Researchers have found that when deaf mothers are engaged in child-directed signing, it's almost as if they instinctually avoid signs that are exceptions to the rule, using mother instead of mommy. It's as if they already know that mommy is somehow an exception to the rule that they'll hold and expose a child to a more typical form first. It's possible that this is an instinct. Word order is another area where this might apply. In child-directed signing, deaf mothers tend to use the same word order patterns. That means less variation in word order. There might still be some variation, but less with young children. This again shows a tendency to highlight the main patterns of the language for very young babies who are acquiring the language. Remember that they're trying to find the patterns, the most salient patterns of their language, so child-directed signing facilitates that. So again, child-directed signing seems to have a function of highlighting certain patterns of the language, making them easier for a child to notice and acquire. At the same time, it also encourages certain types of social development. When a mother is signing with a young baby, even if that baby is not yet old enough to sign or to talk back, the mother may sign something, and then the child makes a movement, which the parent interprets as a turn. These conversational turns then can begin even before the child is able to sign. We can think of this as early training in how conversations are structured. I say something, you say something, and so on. And it doesn't matter that the child isn't yet able to sign much. Child-directed signing permits these kinds of conversations to happen. The child may simply be babbling or making movements, which the parent interprets as though it were a conversational turn. This builds a foundation for dialogue. It lets the child know that this is what a dialogue looks like. So that type of development can already start developing before the child is able to speak or sign. Also, these kinds of early dialogues are a perfect chance for parents to use joint attention, which is our next point. Joint attention simply means the state during which a child and adult are focused on the same thing. Looking at the same thing or being engaged in joint attention is an excellent opportunity for vocabulary learning. In hearing families with hearing children, joint attention does not require the child to look at the parent. Both parent and child are looking at an object. Then the adult can speak the label of that object, and the child can continue looking at that object. They don't need to look at the parent. They continue looking at the object, they hear the label, and they make the connection. And that's vocabulary learning. For deaf children, however, the situation is a little bit different. The parent draws the child's attention to some object, they enter into joint attention, and then the adult has to wait for the child to look at the parent before they give the label for that object. If the child has not yet looked and the parent gives the label, the child misses that label. The timing is off. So timing is very important. However, that timing is often overlooked by parents. Parents themselves may be focused on the object and giving label names without paying attention to whether or not the child has looked back at the parent. This is one area that researchers have noticed might need training for hearing parents. There is some research on joint attention for deaf families with deaf children and what that looks like. What they found so far is that there are many parallels between the function of joint attention in deaf families and hearing families. In both cases, it serves as an important point for learning vocabulary. Some older studies that have compared deaf families with deaf parents and a deaf child with hearing families, with hearing parents, have found that timing tends to be off for joint attention for the hearing families. So often the timing is not quite right. The parent and the child are looking at the object, but the child has not yet looked at the parent, and the parent goes ahead and gives the label. It's possible that in those kinds of family situations, the parents may not be using full ASL, or they may be speaking at the same time as signing. It's not exactly clear from those studies. But in the future, training of hearing parents in ASL might include training not only on vocabulary, on grammar, but also explaining the importance of timing for joint attention, the timing that deaf children need to see a label for an object. That may seem obvious. At the same time, it's not always intuitive and may require some training for hearing families. So, in summary, language acquisition, whether it be in one language or two languages, whether it be for a sign language or for spoken languages, the brain can handle all of these situations. What's important is the input. The input needs to be as high in quality as possible and occur as early as possible for successful acquisition. What does it mean to have optimized input? It involves modifications to the language to raise the quality of that language input. So for a deaf child, for any child, optimizing input makes the patterns of that language easier to notice and acquire. So we can do that by improving joint attention, by using child-directed signing, by including the child in rich conversations, and many other things. Those changes have the effect of making the input better and of a higher quality. And it's not the case that only deaf families can access these types of modifications. Hearing families can be trained in them too. This would involve setting up curricula that focus on not only the language itself, but also how to use the language, not just vocabulary and grammar. So what are the big take-home questions from this webcast? First, all human languages have language patterns. They're complex patterns. Most people, if you ask them about these patterns, they wouldn't be able to answer you about what those look like. They require linguists with training and learning to figure out what these patterns are. But amazingly, babies' brains are already ready to notice and to find these patterns in the language input. If the input that the child receives is of high quality, the brain proceeds with this pattern finding with very little problem and establishes the rules of the language. But of course, this requires good and clear input. If that input is delayed, or if it's degraded in any way, the child doesn't have full access to it. For instance, we can speak terrific English to a child, and the patterns are very clear in that input, but if the baby's deaf and doesn't hear well, those patterns are lost to them. But if the input is not optimal, or if it's delayed, the result is a weak phonological foundation. A weak phonological foundation has impacts on other levels of linguistic processing: syntax, vocabulary, and discourse. All of those levels are impacted, and those impacts are permanent. They don't go away once the child has immersed themselves in a signing environment. Of course, they will sign, they communicate fine. However, the processing of the language is less smooth and less efficient than it could be. That impact is permanent, despite years and years of exposure to the language later. So that is a permanent effect of less effective language processing. How do we avoid that? With high-quality input. Its importance simply can't be overstated. That was a lot of information, but I hope that you'll be able to apply it to your lives and to your schools and to your jobs. There is also a handout that goes with this webcast with more information about what I talked about, the graphs and the references also. You can download that handout from the webpage associated with this webcast. Thank you for watching.